I suppose, first came from a film back in the 70s, I think it was, about a spaceship. But the dark star really sums it up very well. These are sort of Jupiter-sized, or sometimes a little smaller, sometimes a little bigger, but much heavier objects. And they are capable of burning to some degree, but not with the same sort of nuclear events that charge and light our sun. So initially, when they're born, they create quite a lot of light, but over time they become dim, and like the embers of a fire sort of go out, and whatever light they're producing, which I imagine is some, is not sufficient for us to be able to see in the night sky, even with very powerful telescopes. So they're effectively become more or less gas giants, but sort of seething and boiling gas giants, with tremendous storms, and I should think auroras and radiation coming off them and so on, which creates in them sort of the potential for sort of stellar activity, but they're dark, and from all intents and purposes, we've yet to really get a good photograph of an old one, despite all our amazing telescopes and all the amazing techniques that astronomers have at their disposal. They still haven't been able to spot these old ones, you see.
I mean, let's talk about that just a little bit, because what you're in essence saying is absurd, right? I mean, you and I both know that, first of all, Andy is very aware of the secret space program, I believe, and based on your writings and our discussions. But at the same time, in other words, what they let the public know they're aware of and what they actually are aware of are two different things, right?
Well, I'm certainly willing to accept that, yes. I mean, NASA is a very strange beast. I'm not personally entirely convinced, say, for instance, that everything that happened in the 60s with Apollo was above board. There's still lots of question marks over that. The space shuttle industry was completely bizarre. The space station was a white elephant. A lot of what NASA has got up to in the last 30 or 40 years is questionable, very, very questionable. Big projects, huge amount of taxpayers' money going into things which had questionable benefits. Now, some of the great successes of NASA have been their probes to the planets and so on. That's where they've really, really done great work. But their endeavours with sort of human activity have been quite limited and not particularly successful, I would argue. And you have to wonder whether, to some degree, their activities are something of a smokescreen, because, well, I just can't imagine how they've been able to sort of fritter away so much money without the results that one would have anticipated. So yes, there are question marks in my mind about that.
So in terms of NASA and in terms of all of that, recently, I guess it was Jay Weidner, it was Jay Weidner was on my show, and we were talking, and, he's in touch with Hoagland, and he was talking about information about Saturn that had been coming through. And it was really fascinating. And I'm wondering if you're aware of this book, which is called, I don't know if I can remember it now, The Rings of Saturn.
The Ringmakers of Saturn?
Yes.
I've heard of that. Is that about the potential that the rings are artificial to some degree? Is that correct? Or no, I'm not sure.
I haven't read the book, but the astronomer scientist who wrote the book, and I don't have his name in front of me, I'm afraid, but we were told about this book by John Lear in one of my interviews, and you can go back and research that because he talks quite a bit about it. But at any rate, apparently that scientist lives in Northern California and is quite elderly at this moment, but he's quite a brilliant man. And there's, I guess, originally when he wrote the book, there was a lot of skepticism around some of his ideas about Saturn. And now more and more there's getting to be recognition on what he wrote. And I'm very interested in interviewing him if that can be arranged at some point. But I was just curious whether or not you had stumbled on that book. And if not, perhaps it would aid you in your work. I know I'm always trying to give you, I don't know, because of, my exposure in Project Camelot, I keep running into people that have great ideas and, have, come across certain information, and other people who are aware of certain information, but not other. So I love people to try to, network and talk to each other, because I think we're stronger if we actually, on this community that we have, if we start to make these connections. And I'm trying to connect you with Michael Tellinger right now, because he's written a book, Slave Species of the Gods, which has to do with the Anunnaki, and also he's involved in the ruins in South Africa that basically are beginning to look like where Enki created humanity for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, well, that's a very exciting project, and I've seen some of his work, and I think he's producing some very exciting work at the moment. It reminds me very much of Sitchin's some of the work that he's done in previous years. I mean, because obviously Sitchin's getting on a bit now, bless him. But, he used to get out there, out and about, and von Daniken, there's a great tradition with von Daniken, traveling the world to look for evidence for various things. Sometimes he gets it on the spot and sometimes he doesn't, but the enthusiasm he's got for what he does is incredible, and I should think Mr. Tellinger is somewhat of the same sort of expeditionary fervour, quite impressive, really. I don't live up to that myself. I don't get the opportunity to travel the globe, but it's very, very exciting when people come up with sort of field work that will support quite offbeat ideas. Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what I would like you to cover, if you wouldn't mind, is how you got from writing a scientific treatise to exploring the Anunnaki from the aspect of fiction. And I know you're saying that in a sense, maybe it seems like a logical step, but I think to some people it would seem like a stretch. And they would even wonder if, and I have to say from my point of view of Project Camelot, I'm convinced that you chose fiction because you found something out. That you couldn't get away with revealing in any other way. Otherwise, you would be, knocked off, so to speak. But maybe that's not the case. At any rate, can you talk about that?
Well, if that was the case, I wouldn't be able to talk about it, I suppose.
But you can get away with telling all sorts of things in movies as fiction. It's a great. Smokescreen, really.
Well, Steven Spielberg is alleged to have had all kinds of, a lot of his ideas are based on sort of factual evidence, particularly with the UFO phenomenon. I do understand what you're saying. I think it's fair to say that the reason I went into writing the way I did was because I'm a very creative sort of person with my art and so on, and I had some ideas knocking around my head about the Anunnaki, and I wanted to explore them a little bit more freely than I could do with sitting down and writing a non-fiction book, because the thing about non-fiction books is that firstly you've got to fill 150 to 200 pages each time you do it, maybe more, 250 pages or so, with information, and quite often authors will, or bless them, will have a couple of ideas and they'll fill a book with a couple of ideas. And I had some ideas that I wanted to sort of tack on to the Dark Star theory, but it wasn't necessarily sufficient at that time to, encapsulate in an entire book. And I thought that if I did write in a non-fiction format, that I would be in a way just sort of jigging what I've written up till now with the first book, so that people just sort of read it all the way through again before they get to the new bit. And also, I was somewhat inspired by other novel writers who the author of Project Saucer, the books, and Dan Brown as well, who've taken ideas and very successfully created storylines that appeal to large bodies of people. Because as you and I will both be very aware, this